Hello and welcome to episode number 4 of my series BDSMF versus Bigotry. I am Exi Beskov, and in this episode I will talk about misconceptions about BDSM and fetishism. Although this series is about BDSMF, you can also use it in other ways. The things I'm going to talk about is misconceptions on a rather general level, and the same way of thinking can be applied when you think about other minorities. This is about how you conceptualize a group of people, how you think about phenomena out there in the world. The material I work with in this episode is a YouTube debate between Joe James and Republic of Sandals. I have written down all the arguments used and organized them into 4 blocks, which I'm going to present shortly. But before I get into the misconceptions voiced by Republic of Sandals, I want to urge all my viewers to have no ill will against him as a person. Everybody have misconceptions. We just have to work with it over time. This is not about good or bad persons. This is about good or bad ideas. So the 4 blocks are as follows. Block 0, the universe does not revolve around you. I'm not going to get into this block in this episode really, because I have already addressed it in my 2 previous videos. I'm just going to mention the arguments briefly. The other blocks are, which I call definitions, smashinitions, which I think is the most central block really. And then we have evidence and lack thereof. And finally, we have claims of actual harm, which is a very small part of the debate, sadly, but it is very important, so I've given it a block of its own. And finally, I have added another block, which I call adding some classics. These are arguments not used in this particular debate, but they are classically used against BDSM and fetishism, so I'm going to introduce them anyway. To briefly summarize block 0, the universe does not revolve around you, and to recap my counter-arguments, Republic of Sandals has 4 arguments here. First of all, society should treat people into BDSM as pathological because Republic of Sandals consider them to be pathological. My argument here is that you need to use the same rules regardless of who we are talking about. If society is going to treat a certain category of people as pathological because one certain person thinks so, then society should treat any category of people as pathological because any person thinks so. You see where that leads. Second, personal reasons. And my argument there is that if you feel mistreated by one person, then you have reason to be angry with that person. But it's not okay to categorize this person by gender, skin color, sexuality, or what have you, and then denounce this entire category of people. That is categorism, as I call it. In other words, racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on. Third, an appeal to public opinion, that there are some people who dislike people who are into BDSM. And sure they are. There's also some people who dislike a certain gender or skin color or whatever. Public opinion is not an argument in itself. It might be an argument to allow or accept something, but it's not a valid reason to discriminate against people. And number 4, the argument that it is not demonization unless you intend it to be. It's not bigotry if you really think that this category is inferior. That is such a bullshit argument, and if you haven't seen them already, please watch my 2 previous videos in this series which focus on this way of thinking. Okay, moving over to block 1, definitions, machinations. Republic of Sandals claims that BDSM is by definition destructive or abusive. This is the core argument for his entire series of videos, and in the final video he accused you, James, of being incapable of abstract thinking. And the way I understand it, Republic of Sandals has this idea that he has an abstract concept about something and then that's valid just because. However, that is not how it works. If something is in a certain way by definition, then it is that way by your definition. And your definition is not inherently more valid than anybody else's. And it might be very disconnected from actual reality. Republic of Sandals claims that BDSM is pathological in itself. The way I understand it, he claims this on the same ground that it is by definition destructive abuses, it is injury. But these definitions are not reasonable, and psychiatry do not consider them reasonable either anymore. Until 1990, psychiatry did consider BDSM and fetishism to be pathological, but they changed this. With DSM-4, they added a B criteria that there has to be some actual harm, it has to be actual abuse. If it's not, then it's not pathological. I mean, how do you define destructive? How do you define abusive? And how do you define injury? Let's start with injury. It's probably the easiest one. Is an injury something that is breaking down your body? That sounds like a good definition. But how long term does it have to be? In my opinion, an injury should be something that's actually debilitating for at least a little bit longer than just for the moment. Seriously, if you're going to use a very strict definition of injury and destructive, then it's by definition wrong to work out. You see, biologically, it doesn't help you to exercise. Exercise breaks down your muscles. It doesn't do anything positive for them. What helps you build muscles is to recover after your exercise. It's the resting period afterwards that actually help you. So if you're going to make a total out of context definition, then it's by definition destructive and injury to do exercise. Same thing with BDSM. Some forms of it might leave some small bruises that heal rather quickly. It's not reasonable to define that as destructive or injury in itself. As for defining BDSM as being by definition abusive, Republic of Sandals puts quite a lot of focus on disregarding the necessity of consent. And this is very problematic. I'm going to return to it in the third block, the claims of actual harm, and I'm probably going to make more videos about it as well, because consent is complicated, it really is. However, you can't disregard the importance of consent. Consent is the distinction between sex and rape, and the distinction between, on one hand, physical BDSM, martial arts, paintball, and so on, and on the other hand, abuse. Shooting someone with a paintball gun is abuse unless you do it in a painful context where you all agree to participate. And giving someone a tattoo is very severe abuse unless this person consented to getting a tattoo. This should be rather obvious. And as I have pointed out in some previous video that I will probably link in the low bar, being abused does not automatically make you traumatized. Someone can beat you up or rape you or something like that without you getting any permanent psychological damage from it. It happens, and it's rather common that persons get permanently traumatized, or at least long-term traumatized. And this is one of the major reasons why rape and abuse is forbidden. But even if the person isn't traumatized, it is still rape and abuse. So it goes both ways, okay? Finally, Republic of Sandals declares that by his definition, BDSM is a set of fetishes rather than a sexual orientation. And well, everybody do get to define for themselves. So, okay, BDSM isn't an orientation to Republic of Sandals, but that doesn't give him any right to disqualify other people who have BDSM as an orientation. One classic definition of orientation versus preference and perversion or deviance is that, okay, an orientation is a sexuality that you respect. A preference is a sexuality that you accept, while a perversion or deviance is a sexuality that you don't accept. Well, that's one way of looking at it. Another way that is more reasonable, in my opinion, is that an orientation is something that is inherent to you, a part of your wiring or your identity or something like that. It's very core to how you function. A preference is something that doesn't matter so much for you. You like it, it's fun, it's interesting, it can even be emotionally deep, but it isn't you, it's just something you do. And finally, let's just call it destructive sexuality. I'm not comfortable with the words deviance or perversion. They are really loaded in a really bad way. But some sexualities are destructive, and these are the ones where consent would be needed, but valid consent cannot be given. Those sexualities are highly problematic, but that's another issue here. The people who practice BDSM and fetishism are a really diverse lot. For some of them, it's just something funny to do sometimes because, hey, whatever. For others, it is a more deeply rooted preference. It's something they really enjoy, but it's not part of their identity in any way. But for other people, it is a sexual identity. It is the way they function, and they see it as being their instincts. Republic of Sandals claims that there is no sexual instinct to submit, and I can assure you that a lot of submissives disagree with you, and they know their own feelings and instincts better than you do. You do not get to define their lives for them. Stick to defining your own life, that you don't have a submissive instinct, but other people do, and that's their life and their right to live it out on good terms, or to not live it out if they so prefer, or don't find a compatible partner. Finally, there's another definition of orientation versus preference and so on, and that is to arbitrarily define that a preference for men or women, that's an orientation, while other preferences or fetishes or whatever. I completely disagree with this arbitrary norm. By the way, it is based on this dichotomy invented 150 years ago. Someone invented the idea of homosexuality and heterosexuality to divide people by their gender preference. I mean, there has always been people who today would be defined as homosexual, heterosexual, or bisexual, but the division itself is rather new and it's quite arbitrary. Yeah, for some people, gender preference is identity, it is core to who they are. For other people, it doesn't really matter very much. It can be a preference, or, oh, I didn't even notice if my last partner was male or female or intersexual or genderqueer or whatever. Who cares? The division into heterosexual and homosexual, I'm not fond of that at all. I prefer a gender neutral distinction between androphilia, where you're attracted to masculinity and men, and unophilia, where you're attracted to femininity and women. This regardless of how you are categorized, if you are categorized at all. But anyway, calling all sexual preferences fetishes, that is to expand the definition of fetish quite a bit, and I'm really against this broad expansion that Republic of Sandals is doing. Fetishism typically refer to certain materials or objects, or in some definitions body parts, although this is sometimes called partialism instead. So this is why we make a distinction between BDSM and fetishism. It often go hand in hand. It is very intertwined with each other, and this is one of the main reasons why some people started calling the whole thing BDSMF. But anyway, time to move on to the next block, which is evidence and lack thereof. Republic of Sandals keep claiming over and over that he has solid empirical evidence for his claims, but he never presents any evidence whatsoever. My guess is that he misunderstands the concept of empirical. He thinks that if we can define something as being by definition in a certain way, then this is empirical evidence, and it is not. When it comes to whether or not something is harmful, we need to see how it actually affects people in the rather long term as well as the short term. We need to see how they feel about it, how they react to it, how it changes their lives. And we also need to make a strong distinction between the thing in itself and social pressure. If people make you feel like a freak, an outsider, and so on, then that is harmful. Republic of Sandals claim that outside stigma isn't a problem, and this is so much bullshit, so I can't even begin to reply to it. Being defined by others as an outsider, as a freak, as someone who don't belong, as someone who is bad, and so on, that will cause harm. We have massive research on this when it comes to homosexuals and when it comes to ethnic minorities and so on. And the same principle applies to any categorization of people. The empirical evidence that Republic of Sandals do present is twofold. First of all, it's a cherry-picked example of one person who Republic of Sandals personally disliked. And it doesn't work that way. Even if Republic of Sandals have an accurate view of this person, this only says something about this person, not about a category of people as this Republic of Sandals has categorized this person as. I mean, come on. And the other empirical evidence is that he claims to have met several people who claim to be into BDSM and claim to be happy and healthy and so on, but he, Republic of Sandals, do not believe them. This is not empirical evidence in any way, shape or form. But more importantly, even if these particular individuals are very unhappy and just step forward smiling and so on, there are still a multitude of people who have told about their own lives. There's lots and lots and lots of people in the world who have been interviewed in various studies. I recommend the books Different Loving and Pain and Passion just for starters, but there are many other books as well. A lot of people who claim to be happy, healthy, normal individuals. And well, one could argue that they are all lying. You could argue that all homosexuals are lying about not being full of self-hatred. You can argue that all Jews are lying about not secretly controlling the world. But at some point, we just have to trust people. You can't just assume that everybody's lying all the time or that everybody's deluded all the time. It's not reasonable. Finally, Republic of Sandals claims two things. One is that there's a connection between BDSM and mental disorders, that people who do BDSM often have mental disorders and vice versa. If I understand it correctly, it gets this from personal experience, and again, that is cherry-picked. In my long experience, people who have mental diagnoses are more likely to be open about their sexuality than other people. There's a covariance between having a diagnosis and being used to talking about very personal stuff and not having all that much to lose. People who are very highly functional, don't have any mental disabilities or disorders or mental problems whatsoever. They tend to have careers and social positions to care about, and they are very often anxious to talk about their personal lives, especially parts of it that people might disapprove of. I bet that Republic of Sandals have met hundreds of people who are happy, healthy, and into BDSM, but have never introduced themselves to Republic of Sandals as being into BDSM. And since he have this preconception that people are into BDSM or in a certain way, he will never even entertain the thought that these people might be having BDSM in their own personal sex life. This is something I call representation bias. It is very common and it tends to shape our worldview into prejudiced ways. The final argument is that Republic of Sandals claims that we must investigate why people do BDSM, otherwise we'll legitimize domestic abuse and inferiority complexes. The problem here is that what Republic of Sandals are arguing is that we should base this investigation on the assumption that it is pathological, and this is something called garbage in, garbage out. If you limit yourself to a certain preconception, then you will get prejudiced results. there has actually been a lot of studies about why people do BDSM. Some studies that have been based on this preconception and some that have not. And those studies that are not based on the preconceptions, they come to the conclusion that people are into BDSM and fetishism are a varied lot. Some of them have mental problems, some don't. And there are some studies I've seen that have come to the conclusion that most people who are into BDSM do not have mental problems. They might even have less percentage of mental problems than the average population. I'll look up these studies and link them in the low bar later. Anyway, this is our bridge to the third block, the claims of actual harm. The first and most important argument here, Republic of Sandals claim this thing that consent is the only thing that defines BDSM from abuse. And like I said before, yes, and the same thing is true for paintball and martial arts and tattooing and so on. And of course, there is a problem with manipulation and self-harm. If someone pushes someone into doing BDSM or participate in paintball or get a tattoo, it's reasonable to see that as, if not outright abuse, at least borderline abusive. It is a gray area at best, and it is something to be avoided. My first video in this series, before I had encountered this debate between you, James, and Republic of Sandals, was that BDSM should not be based on gender roles or religious beliefs, because if you do that way, some people might feel pressure that they ought to do BDSM acts, and this can get very destructive. Formal consent is not enough. We need to examine ourselves and each other and make sure that we don't participate in anything that feels wrong for us. On any level, take it one step at a time. If you're interested in something, take it easy. And I will make new videos in this series on this topic because it is an important topic, and people like Republic of Sandals actually do have something to contribute by problematizing the whole thing. The way they problematize it is bigoted, but it needs to be problematized. And by the way, this is not limited to BDSM, and fetishism is not even a problem in this regard. I mean, wearing leather or latex clothes, that's very rarely a self-harm thing in itself, okay? But BDSM in various forms, yes, to let someone dominate you or to let someone spank you or tie you up or something, that can be a self-destructive behavior. But let's not forget that so can all other forms of sexual expression. And it seems that the most common form of self-destructive, self-harming sexuality is heterosexual intercourse. We have people who punish themselves and harm themselves by having intercourse with people they are not attracted to or even repelled by in some way. And in the case of women, they can even make sure to have intercourse without being sexually aroused, because that is physically painful in itself. And regardless of gender, it's having sex in a way that you find revolting while telling yourself that you don't deserve any better. Sexuality can be problematic, and we need to be wary about self-harm and destructive and manipulative behavior and so on. One lecture I attended at Stockholm Pride a few years ago. It was a panel, and the representative from RFSL, the Swedish branch of International Gay and Lesbian Alliance, claimed that the vanilla world, both homosexual and heterosexual, have a lot to learn from the BDSM subculture, because problematizing and discussing these problems with nuances of consent and so on is so common in the BDSM subculture. And of course, one could argue that yes, it's more common there because it's more needed there, but this doesn't change the fact. This is a discussion that we do need in all groups and that we should have everywhere, not just where it's most needed, because it is needed everywhere, okay? And again, this claim that stigma doesn't have negative effects. Yes, it does, regardless of circumstances. And even if a stigma is deserved, it's still destructive in itself. It can lock people in bad behavior. So, I mean, the good function that stigma can have is to prevent people who are already happy and healthy and have a good self-image and so on. It can stop them from committing the stigmatized acts. But it will not prevent people who already hate themselves, and it will not stop anyone who's already into the thing. On the contrary, if someone with a bad self-image is into something that is stigmatized, they will just say that, yeah, but society agree with me that I am worthless, so I can just continue doing this thing that is bad for me. Stigma is extremely problematic regardless of circumstances. And I'm not saying that stigma is always wrong. In a few cases it can be the lesser evil, but it is an evil regardless. And what's more? Oh yeah, I've already addressed the things about bad circles that I intended to address, but one more thing. Republic of Sandals claims that it's not bad to have diagnosis. It is not bad to have your way of functioning labeled as bad. And facepalm, it depends on the situation. I mean, diagnoses are social norms. They are not objective like medical diagnoses. I mean, a broken leg is a leg that has a very specific way of functioning and is suddenly broken in a very literal way. But mental diagnoses, sexual or otherwise, they are deviations from a social norm for how things are supposed to be. And these norms can be sometimes very good, sometimes very problematic, and sometimes straight out of the window. The diagnosis of depression is about a social norm that people are supposed to be, if not happy, so at least not deeply full of bad feelings. People shouldn't have to hate themselves and the world. This is a good social norm. To tell someone that you are depressed, this is not how you should be, that's rather okay. It can be empowering for a depressed person, but telling someone who is in love that this is not acceptable, it's bad to love someone, it's bad to have this sex life that you feel good about, that is usually oppression. It's always oppression unless this person is totally deluded about consent. I mean, a stalker or a pedophile may delude themselves that the thing is mutual, and that deserves a mental diagnosis. But to have an actual mutual relationship between consenting adults, to label that from the outside that, oh, you only think you're happy, you actually should hate yourself, or you actually do hate yourselves and each other, you just don't know it yet. Come on, that is so much bullshit. It's patting people on the head. As my final word on this subject, I want to put emphasis on the importance of distinguishing between self-harm and BDSM. This is very often not done. I was in a radio debate in Sweden a few years ago. The other person in the debate was a woman who have written 2 books about self-harm among Swedish youth. And one thing the 2 of us had encountered is how people who work with troubled youth very often don't make this distinction. The version she had encountered was teenagers who were really troubled and had self-harm behavior. And the adult counselor would say, but that's BDSM and that's okay. Like, what? This person is in trouble, this person isn't feeling good. Come on, they're doing something that they feel bad about. Listen to them. Don't dismiss their destructive behavior as something that's okay because you have categorized it as BDSM. Come on. And on the flip side of the coin, we have teenagers who do BDSM and are happy with it, but then people start feeling sorry for them and try to convince them that this is self-harm regardless of what they think about it. You need to listen to what people think and feel about their own situation, how they're actually feeling, not how you think they ought to feel based on some more or less random categorization. Come on. Well, that's all I have to say about the YouTube debate between Joe James and Republic of Sandals. I recommend Joe James' channel, and if you're interested in issues of asexuality, you might want to subscribe to Republic of Sandals as well. In that particular area, he seems to do know what he's talking about. Having said that, I'm moving on to the 4th and final block, adding some classics. I have 10 classic arguments against BDSM, arguments that have not come up in the previously mentioned debate. And the first argument is the idea that interest in BDSM is caused by childhood physical abuse. The idea that children get spanked by their parents and then they want to spank or get spanked as adults. As a hypothesis, that's not unreasonable. However, there is no empirical evidence to support this hypothesis. On the contrary, I've only read one psychiatrist suggest this idea, and he pointed out that it's no longer legal to spank children in Sweden. We know for a fact that childhood physical abuse has dropped like a rock. It's not nearly as common as many decades ago. So if this hypothesis was correct, if his hypothesis was correct, then this sexual orientation or preference would be rather dead by now. We wouldn't have any young adult or hardly even middle-aged adults in Sweden who are into BDSM, but the subculture just keeps growing, and almost every person into BDSM who I've talked with claims to have never been physically or sexually abused as a child. Which brings us to the next point, the idea that if you're into BDSM, it's because you have been sexually abused as a child. And this is what they claim about homosexuality and other sexual orientations / preferences as well. There is really nothing that supports this generalization, but it does have two very classic sources. One is the generic Freudianism that everything goes back to childhood sexuality, and this is rather obsolete. It was never more than a hypothesis in the beginning, but it later turned into a dogma, and thankfully psychiatry is moving away from this dogma. The other thing is representation bias. When a minority is stigmatized, who are you going to hear? The happy and healthy people will not come forward. And what has happened with homosexuals and sadomasochists, or that the research has been done on those who are in therapy or in prison, and what it boils down to is that among the people who are in therapy for having been sexually abused as a children, of these people, some of them are into BDSM, and of these people who are in therapy because they have been sexually abused as children and are into BDSM, 100% has been sexually abused as children. Well, duh! That's a biased selection. It doesn't say anything about the population as a whole. Moving on to the next point, it's the notion that being into BDSM is caused by hatred. This hypothesis has been disproven as well. People who are into BDSM are generally not driven by hatred. Of course, there are some people who are, and this goes for heterosexuality as well. Some people who seek out partners in a destructive and self-destructive manner. I talked about that before, but you can't really generalize like that. And well, most importantly, this general idea about hatred, like I said in my first video, it comes from this book, Perversion, the Erotic Form of Hatred. And this book did not claim to have evidence that people who are categorized as deviant are filled with hatred. What the book argued was that people who are not filled with hatred, who are not driven by hatred, should not be categorized as perverted. That's the opposite of what has been preached in the name of this book. Notion number 4 is the idea that BDSM hides literal abuse, that people are just pretending to have consent, but they're actually forcing people to pretend to consent. And this kind of situation can happen, and it's something we have to look out for. Make sure that actual consent is upheld. One of the social norms in the BDSM subculture is that as a person involved in such a relationship, especially if you're the submissive, but also as the dominant, you should always have other people to talk to and turn to, so you can discuss your feelings with people who respect you and know you and think that you deserve a good relationship. You should never settle for a bad relationship, and if you are in an abusive relationship, you need escape routes, you need ways to get out of it. So yes, just like abuse can be hidden within a mainstream heterosexual vanilla marriage, it can also be hidden within a BDSM relationship. And this is something we have to look out for in all kinds of relationships. But you can't generalize like that. It's not all that common, although it does happen. Moving on to more philosophical notions, we have number 5. The notion that BDSM would not be compatible with Kant's categorical imperative. One of the formulations of Kant's categorical imperative is that you should always act so that you can want the rule behind your action to be upheld as universal law. And the rule here is not that it's okay to hit people. The rule is that consent is what defines whether or not an action is okay or not. And this goes not just for hitting and not just in sexual contexts. I'm talking about paintball and tattoos and martial arts before, but what about a simple hug? If we're going to interpret Kant's categorical imperative as you must decide that either hugs are okay or they are not, no, that's not an acceptable rule. The rule has to be about consent. You don't just walk up to strangers and grab them and say that, oh, but this was a hug. You can walk up like that to someone you know and have reason to believe that he or she or they or whatever enjoys that and are okay with that, but you get the idea here. So no, BDSM is not a problem with Kant. And also we have another formulation of Kant's categorical imperative, that you should always treat people as an end to themselves, not just as a mean to something you want. And this really comes in here. The last video I made in another series was about people not feeling safe in other people's relationships. You can't demand that other people revolve their lives around your personal needs. That goes against Kant's categorical imperative. So accepting BDSM that is done on good terms, that is not against the imperative, but forbidding it, that's against Kant's categorical imperative. Next step, we have the golden rule, that you should treat others like you want to be treated. And this is really the alpha version of Kant's categorical imperative. It is full of loopholes. If you don't want to go with the spirit of it, but by the word, then you can get all kinds of bullshit conclusions. Again, with either hitting someone is okay or it isn't, or either it's okay to fondle someone's private parts or it isn't. Either you have to accept groping strangers or you have to forbid making out between lovers. Come on! But the golden rule opens for another bullshit thingy. This idea that it's okay for me to sexually touch someone who I would want to be sexually touched by, and it's okay for me to do sexual acts that I would like to have done to me. You have to go with what's okay for that person, not with what is okay for you. This is really obvious if you go with the spirit of the golden rule, but if you go with the actual wording, then you can get that kind of nonsense, and people tend to do. I have seen this bullshit argument many times. So, number 7, the notion that BDSM would not be compatible with utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, that's the idea that you should maximize the total happiness in the world, that people should have as good lives as possible, and this includes harm reduction, but harm reduction is really a side effect, because if people are unhappy, then this really brings their happiness down, okay? Simple as that. But you have to look at what is happiness for one person, and living in the way that you enjoy and are happy with, that is happiness for you. It's not utilitarianism to force other people to live in a way that would make you happy. So you have to look to how people actually think and feel. And well, let's just take this in the second point, notion number 9. Notion number 8. The notion that accepting BDSM would be against negative utilitarianism, the concept of never do any harm. And this negative utilitarianism, that you should always avoid harm, it's a very good principle when you are interacting with strangers. You don't know how to make them happy, so at least avoid making them unhappy. In that specific context, negative utilitarianism is very good. But if you take it as a general rule, it becomes very destructive. I mean, when it comes to participating in BDSM or watching horror movies or going on roller coaster rides or anything that may cause you temporary harm, you need to look at the big picture. You need to have full utilitarianism, not only negative utilitarianism. I already talked about the absurd idea that it would be wrong to exercise because it temporarily hurts your muscles, never mind that they will be built up from it later. If we go with pure negative utilitarianism, it is wrong to exercise, and it's also wrong to watch a movie that will temporarily make you sad, even if you feel good about the whole thing afterwards. And in the same way, it will also be wrong to do BDSM, but the entire system is wrong. And if you do accept negative utilitarianism as the overarching rule, then the only reasonable conclusion is genocide, that you need to murder everybody, because everybody who is alive today will experience unhappiness, pain, bad emotions, bad situations, and so on in their lives. If you go to regular utilitarianism, the idea is that you need the good to outweigh the bad. But if you look only at the bad, well, the only way to stop all suffering is to stop all life. So it's totally wrong to apply negative utilitarianism on a grand scale. It becomes very destructive and unreasonable. Okay, moving on to the real point number 9 now. It's the notion that accepting BDSM would go against a certain utopian vision or something like that. I'm thinking about radical feminism here, but the same goes for Marxists who, or communists who think that homosexuality is wrong because in the natural workers' paradise everybody should be heterosexual. That's the vision we had. You can't squeeze people into your visions. Real people have their own lives. They are not puppets for your visions. Keep your visions to yourself. You can use them as inspiration as you want, but don't use them to oppress other people. The universe does not revolve around you, so keep your utopian visions to yourself. Okay, that's all I have to say about that one. And of course, as number 10, we have this phenomenon that Joe James summarized as, quote, "It's wrong because we hate it, and we hate it because it's wrong," unquote. Very obvious circular reasoning, and very much this thing that I've been talking about, but the universe does not revolve around you. If you think that something is disgusting, then don't do this something. If you think that a certain dessert or foodstuff, some vegetable or candy or whatever tastes bad, don't eat it. But if you don't have empirical evidence that it causes cancer or whatever, don't stop other people from eating it. Their taste is their own, and keep your hatred to yourself. Sometimes hatred can be used as a positive force, but that is rather rare. Just dumping your own negative emotions on other people, that's just a part of making the world a worse place. So don't do that. Your bullshit is your own. And with those words, I'm finished with this video and this particular debate. But I will return to BDSMF versus bigotry in the future. And I will talk about those things I touched on before, about identity and preference and finding yourself and making sure that you don't harm yourself or others. So feel very welcome to comment in the comment section or by mail or video responses or whatever. Whatever critique or questions or input you might have, I am quite likely to address it in future responses. And I will put this up on certain Facebook groups and forums and so on. So I will discuss this with the BDSMF subculture and so on. Well, that's all I have to say for now. Live long and prosper.